Forget the castles, forget the crowns, forget the polished story of England you think you know, because before there was an England, there were only stones. Silent, immovable, eternal. On the windswept plains of Salisbury, Stonehenge rose like a question carved in rock. Who built it? Why? No one can say, but its shadow still falls across the birth of a nation. Then came the Celts, warriors in painted skin, druids whispering secrets to the forest, songs echoing beneath the hills. Not myths, not savages, but a people whose spirit still lingers in the land. Rome followed, iron roads, soaring walls, and the clash of empire against wild. For a moment, Britannia belonged to Caesar's dream, until the dream collapsed, and the island was left alone in the dark. Out of that darkness rose legends. Arthur, a king, or perhaps only a memory, fighting to hold back the tide. But no legend could stop what was coming. Across the sea came new tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes. They carried with them fire, iron, and a name that would outlast them all, England. This is not just history. This is the dawn of a story of stones, swords, and souls, a story that began not with kings, but with silence. The legendary beginning. The dawn broke slowly across the Salisbury plain, casting pale gold over the mist that clung to the earth. Out of the haze, dark monoliths loomed, their ancient silhouettes etched against the horizon. To stand before Stonehenge was to stand before time itself, before written memory, before the rise and fall of empires. The stones bore no inscriptions, no voices of their makers, yet they spoke through their very presence. They were witnesses, silent, immovable, to the birth of a land that would one day be called England. Long before England had a name, before Saxons or Celts or Romans, this island was carved by ice and sea. The retreat of glaciers left behind green valleys and rolling hills, rivers winding like veins across a body newly awakened. Into this land came small bands of hunters, wrapped in animal skins, following herds of wild aurochs and red deer. They left few traces, save for bones, flint tools, and the occasional burial. Yet even in these fragile fragments, there was evidence of something greater stirring. A people beginning to wonder not only how to survive, but how to belong to the land. The shift from wandering to settlement marked the first great turning point in the island's story. Around 4000 BCE, Neolithic farmers crossed from the continent, bringing with them seeds, livestock, and the idea of permanence. They cleared forests, built huts, cultivated grain, and raised cattle. In their world, the seasons ruled with an iron hand, summer's bounty, winter's hunger, the delicate balance between life and death. To track these cycles was not merely practical, it was spiritual, and so they turned to the sky. It was here on the windswept plains of southern Britain that human ambition reached for the heavens in stone. Stonehenge did not emerge in an instant. It rose in stages, across centuries, as generations laid down earth and timber, then replaced wood with sarsen and bluestone. Imagine the labor. Hundreds of people hauling stones that weighed as much as 40 tons, dragging them across miles of land and river, using only ropes, wooden sledges, and sheer muscle. Each stone raised was a declaration. We are here, we endure, we look to the eternal sky. The first stage was a circular ditch and mound, carved with antler picks around 3000 BCE. Within it, they placed posts and aligned spaces to mark celestial events. Later came the smaller bluestones, carried all the way from the Preseli Hills of Wales, nearly 150 miles distant. Why bring them from so far? The answer remains a mystery, but perhaps those stones held sacred power. Perhaps their home mountains were revered. Finally, the great sarsens were erected, capped with lintels to form mighty trilithons, a ring within a ring, a monument both earthly and cosmic. At the solstices, the stones aligned with the sun. On Midsummer's Day, the rising sun would pierce the circle, flooding its heart with light. On Midwinter's Eve, the setting sun would sink between the uprights, sinking into darkness, marking the endless rhythm of life, death, and rebirth. To those who built it, this was no mere calendar. It was a bridge between worlds, the living and the dead, the earth and the heavens. But Stonehenge was more than engineering. It was a stage where rituals unfolded, where drums beat, fires burned, and chants rose into the night sky. Archaeology has uncovered human remains, offerings of tools and animal bones scattered in patterns, signs of feasts and funerals, of gatherings that brought distant tribes together. Here, clans may have pledged alliances, leaders may have claimed divine authority, and communities may have sought blessing for harvests. It was not only a monument, it was a theater of belief. As the centuries passed, the builders of Stonehenge faded into legend. Their culture left no written word, only stone and soil. Yet their legacy endured, echoing in myths that centuries later would speak of druids, wizards, and kings. Even in the Middle Ages, poets and chroniclers would insist that Merlin himself had conjured Stonehenge with magic. The truth is less romantic but no less profound. It was human hands, bound by vision and faith, that lifted those stones. And in their silent strength, the stones outlasted every civilization that followed. Beyond Stonehenge, the island was alive with other monuments, long barrows, chambered tombs, hill forts. Each structure whispered of a society rooted in land and sky, of ancestors honored and gods invoked. Together they formed a sacred landscape, a memory map where every mound and circle held meaning. To walk that land was to walk among spirits. And yet, beneath the sacred, there was struggle. Life was fragile. Crops could fail, winters bite, strangers raid. For all the grandeur of their monuments, the people of Neolithic Britain were locked in a daily contest with nature, and so they clung to their rituals, believing that stone and ceremony might bind the chaos of the world. The omniscient eye sees how this era set the stage. Though centuries would pass, though Romans and Saxons and Normans would come, the essence remained. A people shaped by land, by cycles of sun and season, by the hunger for permanence. Stonehenge stood as the first great symbol of that hunger. Imagine a night 3,000 years before Christ. The plain is dark, the sky ablaze with stars. Torches flicker around the stones, casting long shadows. A procession approaches. Men, women, children, carrying offerings of food and bone. At the circle's heart, a priest raises his hands to the heavens. The chant begins, low at first, then rising like the tide. Above them, the stars wheel. Before them, the stones loom eternal. For a moment, the fragile lives of mortals seem bound to the infinite. This is the dawn of story, of myth, of history. Stonehenge would endure, but its builders would not. By the Bronze Age, new waves of people arrived, bringing metal tools, new customs, and new gods. Yet they inherited the landscape shaped by their forebears. They reused the stones, buried their dead in mounds nearby, inscribing their own chapters onto the land. Every new arrival layered history atop history, never erasing, but transforming. This is the pattern of England, not a single birth, but a succession of dawns. Stonehenge was the first, a monument that outlasted its makers, a riddle that defied time. When the Celts came, they would see it as ancient even then. When the Romans arrived, they would marvel at it as the work of giants. When the Saxons settled, they would inherit a land already haunted by monuments too old to comprehend. Each age looked back in wonder. Each age reimagined the past. Thus begins the story of England, not with kings or battles, but with stone and sky, with people who dreamed beyond survival. It is a story written in earthworks and monuments, in bones and ashes, in the eternal dialogue between humanity and the cosmos. Stonehenge is the prologue, the first voice in a chorus that will echo for millennia. The mists lift, the sun rises higher, and the plain awakens. Sheep graze where once rituals thundered. Tourists and scholars walk paths where priests once chanted. Yet the stones remain, patient as always, guardians of a memory older than nations. They remind us that England's story did not begin with conquest or crown, but with the human desire to mark time, to touch eternity, to declare, "We were here." And yet, to grasp the true magnitude of Stonehenge, one must look closer. Not at the myths it later inspired, but at the hands that raised it. The stones we see today did not appear as a finished vision, but as the patient labor of generations. To understand how England's first great monument came to life, we must return to its beginning, to the chalk, the timber, and the slow birth of stone itself. The making of Stonehenge, 3000 to 2000 BCE. The story did not begin with stone, but with earth. Long after the first fields were sown and the first paths pressed into the chalk, a people gathered on the Salisbury Plain and inscribed a great circle into the ground. With antler picks glinting in pale light, they bit into the white chalk and hauled it away in wicker baskets. The work raised a ditch and an outer bank, a crisp white ring that caught the sun and could be seen from far across the open land. When the wind blew, chalk dust lifted like ghostly breath. When night fell, the circle lay under the stars like a drawn compass, waiting for what would come. Inside the henge, they set posts and cut neat round pits, some of which would later be called Aubrey holes, each a measured point in a geometry that only the builders fully understood. Timber uprights creaked into place, fires were kindled, footprints multiplied in the fresh-cut chalk. The first phase was a promise more than a monument, a frame for gatherings and rites, a canvas stretched taut across the plain. Time moved with the patience of seasons. Generations took up tools where their elders left off. The circle of earth did not satisfy. The builders wanted the sky to answer, and for that they needed stone that would stand when wood rotted and memories faded. So, decades, perhaps centuries, after the ditch was cut, smaller pillars of bluestone arrived from the west, from hills whose rain-soaked slopes lay almost unimaginable distances away. Whether dragged on sledges over land, floated along rivers on rafts, or inched forward with rollers and ropes, the stones came. The spectacle of their passage would have been a moving festival of muscle and song. Teams hauling in rhythm, watchmen calling time, elders offering blessing, children running alongside to touch a future none of them would live to see. These bluestones, cool to the hand and dark when wet, were stood upright within the sacred ring, first in formats that shifted and shifted again, circles nested within circles, then ovals, then horseshoes. The arrangement itself felt alive, as if the builders were tuning the monument like an instrument until it sang the right note at sunrise and sunset. Each repositioning carried the thrill of discovery and the gravity of ceremony, a society engraving its cosmology in mineral and measure. Then came the age of the giants. From the Marlborough Downs to the north, vast sarsen blocks, some weighing as much as a dozen men put together could scarcely imagine, were quarried and coaxed toward the site. The plain must have thrummed with preparation, sledges thick with grease, ropes twisted from plant fiber, rollers cut from trunks, ramps thrown up from chalk and earth. There is drama in the mind's eye, a line of haulers leaning into harness, heels digging, a foreman's arm cutting the air. The sledge moans forward a finger's breadth, then a foot, then, at last, a yard. When a stone reached the circle, the ground shook with cheers. Lifting was art as much as labor. Earthen mounds rose like siege works. Men with poles and levers pried the sarsen upright inch by inch, letting gravity take the last decision as the great block dropped into its prepared socket with a resonant thud felt in every ribcage nearby. On top of the uprights, lintels would be laid, not simply balanced, but locked. The builders shaped tenons atop the uprights and carved mortises beneath the lintels, then joined lintel to lintel with tongue and groove so the outer ring would run as a true continuous crown. They were carpenters in stone, their chisels and mauls translating techniques born in wood into a monument meant to outlast wood, bone, and memory. Precision guided ambition. The lintel ring was trimmed so its top followed a steady course, compensating for uneven ground, while the inner horseshoe of taller trilithons leaned inward just enough to suggest strength gathered and contained. Across the plain, a single standing outlier, the heelstone, kept a watch where the avenue, a ceremonial way of paired banks and ditches, drew a path from the river Avon to the Henge. On summer solstice morning, the sun would lift along that line and spear the circle with light. On winter solstice evening, the sun would sink precisely between uprights, and the gathered would feel the year turn within the stone's geometry. Stonehenge was never a frozen plan. It was a dialogue over centuries. Bluestones were removed, returned, and recomposed, as if the builders were revising a sacred text. Some stones were reshaped, others left rough, their scars the handwriting of different hands across time. Around the monument, life answered with feasts and footfall. To the northeast, at places like Durrington Walls, timber circles and a sprawling settlement flared to life seasonally, the detritus of great gatherings, cattle bones split for marrow, pig jaws gnawed clean, piling up like applause after a performance. People traveled to the plain from far-off valleys, carrying the accents of their home streams and the hopes of their clans, converging to witness the sun do as the stones demanded. What the builders believed is not ours to know in full, but their actions testify to a faith with weight and measure. They tracked the heavens not only to keep time, but to bind time, to reassure themselves that the arc of the year, and perhaps the arc of a life, could be understood and honored. They created a place where the living could address the dead, where the dead might be remembered in the turning of the light, and where leaders could claim legitimacy under a sky that agreed with their stones. Power was performed here, community was rehearsed here, grief and gratitude were given form here. By around 2000 BCE, the composition that modern eyes most readily recognize was largely in place. The outer circle of sarsen uprights, crowned with lintels. Within, the tall horseshoe of trilithons. In between, the bluestones gathering and regathering in smaller arcs, as if paying homage to their larger cousins. The chalk banks had softened at the edges, and grass had begun to blur the ramps. But the stones themselves had taken on the authority of mountains. They spoke to dawn and dusk in a language of edges and gaps, of shadows cast and corridors of light, and the sky answered on cue. Across 1,000 winters and summers, the builders had learned to think like the sun and to lift like the earth. Their labor stitched together clans, techniques, and time. Each generation inherited an unfinished sentence and added its clause, then passed the work forward. What they made was not simply a place, it was a machine for meaning, a cathedral without a roof, a reckoning between human frailty and the wideness of the cosmos. And when at last the hauling songs grew faint and the great levers were laid aside, the monument they left did not close the story. It opened it. Stonehenge stood ready for the rites and reckonings of those who followed, a vast instrument tuned to the light, holding its note across millennia. The stones stood complete, but their silence was not empty. If the builders had spoken through earth and granite, then what they left behind was not just a monument, but a message. The question is, what did it mean? Purpose and theories. Stonehenge stood completed, its stones aligned with sky and season, yet its meaning remained elusive even to those who lived centuries later. The monument was no single story, but a chorus of possibilities, and modern minds can only glimpse its role through fragments of bone, charred wood, and the silent geometry of its design. To ask what Stonehenge was for is to peer into a mist as thick as the one that rolls across Salisbury Plain at dawn. Still, through that mist, shapes emerge, hypotheses carved from archaeology and imagination. The first and most enduring vision is Stonehenge as a cosmic calendar. Its uprights and lintels do not scatter at random. They mark the rising and setting of the sun at solstices, and perhaps other celestial events across the year. On midsummer's morning, light spears down the avenue and touches the altar space within. On midwinter's evening, the sun sinks precisely between two pillars, as if the stones themselves were framing the heavens. To the builders, this precision must have been more than curiosity. In a world governed by planting and harvest, survival depended on knowing the rhythm of the year. Stonehenge may have been their cosmic clock, a vast, open-roofed observatory binding time to place. Yet it was not simply practical astronomy. The third-person eye can see the drama. A gathered crowd in winter, waiting through the long darkness, hearts tight with hunger and fear. As the sun slides between the stones, light flares where it must, and the year turns. The relief is communal, visceral, proof that the cycle endures, that death gives way to rebirth, that the gods, or the ancestors, still favor them. Another vision sees Stonehenge as a temple of the dead. Archaeologists have uncovered cremated remains in the earliest ring, the white chalk still holding fragments of bone. The nearby River Avon linked Stonehenge to Durrington Walls, a timber circle that may have represented the world of the living. The avenue leading between them becomes a symbolic journey, wood for life, stone for eternity. The dead may have been carried downriver, processed along the avenue, and laid to rest within the embrace of the stones. In this reading, Stonehenge is less an observatory and more a threshold, a place where mortals honored their ancestors and sought communion with the unseen. And yet another interpretation imagines Stonehenge as a healing sanctuary. The blue stones, hauled from distant Welsh mountains, may have been revered for their sacred properties. Fragments of human bone around the site reveal signs of injury and disease. Some scholars suggest that pilgrims came here to be cured, believing the stones themselves held powers of restoration. In this theory, the monument was not only a graveyard, but also a hospital of faith, where the sick sought the touch of eternity to heal mortal wounds. Still others propose Stonehenge as a political theater. Its construction demanded labor on a scale rare in prehistoric Europe. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of people collaborated over generations, gathering from distant valleys to lend hands and voices. The work itself was ceremony, a demonstration of leadership, unity, and control. To gather so many bodies, to command so much labor, was to announce authority. When completed, the monument served as a stage where elites could host feasts, make alliances, and present themselves as mediators between sky and soil. The stones did not merely hold up the sun, they held up the power of those who claimed to read its signs. Yet no single function excludes the others. Stonehenge could be all at once: calendar, tomb, temple, sanctuary, and council chamber. Like the human heart, it beat with many chambers, but one pulse: the desire to make sense of existence. For the builders, survival was never only about food or shelter. It was about meaning, about writing permanence against the backdrop of impermanence. The stones gave them that permanence. Centuries later, long after the builders were dust, mythmakers filled the silence with their own explanations. Medieval chroniclers whispered of giants who carried the stones from Africa, or of Merlin, the wizard who conjured them into place by magic. To the eyes of the Saxons, they were works of gods. To the Romans, they were remnants of a forgotten race. Each culture projected its own fears and fascinations upon the circle. Even in ignorance, the stones continued to function, if not as calendar or tomb, then as mirror, reflecting the imagination of each age. Modern science sharpens the image, but cannot dispel the mystery. Archaeologists measure alignments, date charcoal, and trace isotopes in bone. Yet beyond data, the site still hums with enigma. Theories shift like light through morning fog, now highlighting the sacred, now the scientific, now the political. None alone is enough. All together remind us that Stonehenge is not only a structure, but a question, a riddle set in stone. And so the cinematic eye pulls back. The plain lies open, the circle intact. The solstice sun rises, light streaming through the trilithons as shadows stretch long. A crowd of figures stands in reverent silence, whether they are Neolithic farmers, Bronze Age chiefs, or modern visitors. For all of them, the stones still ask the same question. What are we to the cosmos, and how shall we mark our place within it? The answer may never be final. But in the enduring presence of Stonehenge, the question itself becomes sacred. And when theories could not settle the riddle, imagination stepped in. For if Stonehenge was a question carved in stone, then the centuries that followed supplied their own answers, woven not from chalk and granite, but from myth, legend, and longing. Stonehenge, in the imagination of posterity, when the hands that had raised the stones were long gone, when the voices of the builders had dissolved into soil and silence, Stonehenge remained. Its trilithons stood like broken teeth against the horizon, defying wind, rain, and time itself. Without the memory of its makers to explain it, the monument slipped from history into legend, and in that realm it grew even larger. To the Celts who later roamed the plains, Stonehenge was already ancient, already the work of others lost in a shadowy past. The Druids, guardians of ritual and law, were linked to it by the imagination of later centuries. Medieval chroniclers saw them pacing in white robes, chanting beneath the stones, measuring the heavens with sacred knowledge. The truth, known now, is that the Druids lived long after Stonehenge was raised. Yet the image of them presiding there became so vivid that it has never been entirely erased. Even today, on solstice mornings, modern Druids and seekers gather in robes to greet the rising sun as though fulfilling a prophecy carved in chalk and stone. The Middle Ages embroidered the site with myth. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the 12th century chronicler who shaped the legends of King Arthur, declared that Stonehenge was the handiwork of Merlin the wizard. In his tale, the stones were brought from Ireland, stolen from a sacred mountain, and set on Salisbury Plain by sorcery. Knights, kings, and giants played their part in the fable, each layer of imagination folding the stones deeper into the fabric of national myth. To a people who believed in dragons, saints, and miracles, the notion that giants or enchanters raised the circle was not absurd but necessary. How else could mortals have moved such massive blocks? Later still, in the age of Renaissance curiosity, scholars peered at the ruins with measuring rods and quills. Some believed it was a Roman temple dedicated to Saturn. Others saw in it a memorial to fallen Britons, or a triumphal monument raised by some forgotten conqueror. Each theory revealed more about the age that proposed it than about the stones themselves. Stonehenge became a mirror reflecting the obsessions of each passing generation: conquest, faith, magic, or science. By the 18th and 19th centuries, when antiquarians roamed the countryside sketching ruins, Stonehenge had become a romantic ruin, a canvas for poets and painters. William Blake imagined it as a symbol of druidic power and spiritual tyranny. Artists rendered it at dusk, storm clouds massing above or under moonlight, the stones stark and lonely. To the Romantics, it was a reminder of the sublime, of nature's grandeur and humanity's smallness, of mysteries unsolved and ages long lost. Travelers stood among the trilithons and felt the weight of time pressing down, a sensation at once terrifying and exhilarating. In the 20th century, as archaeology advanced, the stones stepped again into the realm of science. Radiocarbon dating, careful excavation, and analysis of human remains shifted Stonehenge from the magical to the measurable. Yet even as facts accumulated, the aura of mystery did not fade. If anything, it deepened. For while we may now know how old the stones are, from where they were dragged, and even what people ate at the feasts nearby, the why remains tantalizingly out of reach. Science explained the mechanics, but imagination still filled the heart. And imagination continues. In popular culture, Stonehenge appears in novels, films, songs, and even comedy. It is depicted as a portal to other worlds, a landing site for aliens, a machine for forgotten gods. It has been a setting for horror and for satire, for fantasy quests and philosophical musings. Its image graces album covers, postcards, and tourist brochures. No other monument of prehistory has been so thoroughly woven into modern imagination. Yet beneath every new story, the same ancient pulse beats. Stonehenge endures not simply because it is old or grand, but because it refuses to be solved. It resists the final word. It invites wonder. The omniscient gaze sees a plain alive with pilgrims of many centuries, Celtic bards, medieval monks, romantic poets, modern tourists, and seekers in feathered cloaks at dawn. Each comes seeking meaning, and each finds a different Stonehenge. In this way, the monument's true function in later ages has been to anchor dreams. It has become a vessel for whatever a people most feared or desired. The power of druids, the magic of Merlin, the precision of Roman engineers, the sublimity of nature, the reach of science, the playfulness of art. The stones, unmoved, accept every interpretation. They are guardians not only of the past, but of the imagination itself. And so, as the sun rises once more over Salisbury Plain, the circle glows with light and legend alike. The builders are forgotten, yet the monument lives, half fact, half fable. In the imagination of posterity, Stonehenge is never finished, always becoming. It is at once ruin and temple, puzzle and poem, relic and dream. And if Stonehenge itself became a vessel for myth and memory, it did not stand alone. Beyond the circle stretched a wider sacred landscape, avenues, barrows, and timber rings that turned all of Salisbury Plain into a theater of ritual and remembrance. The sacred landscape and its echoes. Stonehenge was never an island. Its stones, though monumental, belonged to a wider constellation of earthworks, tombs, avenues, and wooden circles scattered across the Salisbury Plain. To see only the trilithons is to miss the chorus in which they sang. The monument was the heart, but around it pulsed a living landscape of ritual and remembrance. Stretching out from the circle, the land is scored with lines and mounds, gossamer traces of an ancient choreography. Burial barrows rise like sleeping giants on the horizon, their rounded forms softened by centuries of wind. Each barrow, once fresh with chalk, marked a resting place of the dead. Some held warriors, others elders, still others offerings of pottery, amber, or animal bone. Together, they made the land itself a cemetery, a map of ancestry where the living could not walk without treading near their forebears. The avenue, cut into the earth with twin banks and ditches, ran from Stonehenge down to the river Avon. It was not a road of commerce, but of ceremony. Imagine a procession. Priests in robes of woven wool, torches flaring against twilight, mourners carrying ashes in pots or bones wrapped in hides. From the river, a place of transition, where water flows between realms, they ascended toward the stones. Each step along the avenue was a step from the world of the living toward the eternal. By dawn, they reached the circle, where the dead were committed to the keeping of stone and sky. Further along the Avon lay Woodhenge and Durrington walls, vast timber rings and settlement sites that hummed with life during festivals. Here, archaeologists found traces of houses, hearths, and feasts. Pig bones with cut marks show animals slaughtered for gatherings. Pottery fragments still carry residue of mead and stew. The living crowded into these timber circles, eating, drinking, celebrating. Then, when death came, they carried their departed down the river, across the avenue, to Stonehenge, the realm of stone and silence. In this choreography of wood and stone, scholars glimpse a duality: wood for life, stone for death. Durrington for the vibrant, Stonehenge for the eternal. Between them flowed the Avon, a silver thread of passage. The landscape itself became a cosmic map, each monument a word in a sacred sentence about existence and its cycles. To the omniscient eye, the plain appears not as empty grass, but as a stage alive with shifting scenes. In summer, smoke rises from feast fires at Durrington, laughter and music echoing across the valley. At midwinter, the avenue fills with solemn processions, bodies wrapped and borne toward the stone circle where the sun's last light falls between the trilithons. Hills glow with the white scars of freshly dug barrows, each mound crowned with offerings. The entire land was scripted as ritual, every path rehearsed, every mound a verse in the epic of life and death. Stonehenge, then, was not solitary architecture, but the axis of a larger cosmology. The people who built it thought not in single monuments, but in landscapes of meaning. They shaped the land so that living and dead, past and future, sun and river were bound together. And in that binding, they found identity and order. Even today, the sacred landscape speaks. From the air, the pattern of circles and lines is still visible. Faint rings etched in grass, shadows of ditches that once rang with song. Tourists tread paths once followed by mourners. Archaeologists kneel where children once danced around fires. Farmers plow fields that overlay forgotten bones. Beneath each footstep is another story, another life folded into the earth. This layering is the true genius of the landscape. Stonehenge was never static. It was always a conversation across generations. Each mound raised, each circle cut, each avenue traced was a response to what came before. The plain became a palimpsest, a living text rewritten again and again, yet never erased. For posterity, the plain now seems quiet, the stones patient, the barrows still. But in the cinematic mind, one can still see the echoes. The flare of torches along the avenue, the shimmer of the river carrying souls, the thunder of drums at midwinter, the hush as the sun strikes the heart of the trilithon. In such visions, the sacred landscape is not dead, but waiting, its silence thick with memory. Thus, Stonehenge was both monument and node, one voice among many, yet the one that drew all others into harmony. It commanded not just attention, but belonging. To live on this land was to live within its ritual map, to walk paths set by ancestors, to be remembered beneath barrows, to face the sky framed by stone. And so, the sacred landscape of Salisbury was less a collection of ruins than a living cathedral, roofless, sprawling, and eternal. In it, the people of Neolithic Britain inscribed their faith in cycles, in connection, in the truth that no life stands alone. Every feast, every burial, every stone was part of the same great liturgy of time. And just as the sacred landscape of Salisbury carried the voices of those who built in stone and wood, so too would a new people arrive, bearing iron, song, and myth, to inscribe their own chapter upon Britain's unfolding story. The arrival of the Celts, 700 BCE. The stones of Salisbury still cast their shadows when a new people began to sweep across the island, bringing with them iron, song, and myth. Around 700 BCE, the great tide of Celtic tribes spread westward from continental Europe, carrying not only weapons and cattle, but an entire worldview that would forever alter the destiny of Britain. They did not arrive as a single conquering army, but as waves of migration. Tribes and clans, families and warriors, pushing into the valleys and hills, carving settlements into forests and claiming the chalk ridges as their new domain. Their journey was marked by resilience, for they came from a culture forged in mobility and conflict. To the eye of history, the Celts appeared as both settlers and storm, shaping the land with iron while singing to it in languages that still echo in the mountains of Wales and the coasts of Cornwall. Where the Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples had raised monuments of stone, the Celts brought mastery of ironworking. The ring of hammer against anvil replaced the thud of antler picks. Blades gleamed sharper, stronger, and deadlier than bronze could ever yield. With iron plows, they opened soil that had resisted the farmers before them, and with iron swords, they secured those fields against rivals. Villages fortified themselves on high ground, encircled by wooden palisades and earthen ramparts. These hill forts, like Maiden Castle in Dorset, rose as beacons of both defense and identity, living symbols of tribes that now called this land their own. The omniscient gaze reveals a Celtic settlement, roundhouses with thatched roofs clustered like petals around a central hearth, smoke curling into the sky. Children chase pigs through muddy lanes. Women weave bright cloths dyed with woad and madder, their patterns twisting in spirals and knots as though reflecting the cosmic order. Warriors polish shields and sharpen spears, the iron catching the firelight. At night, storytellers gather by the flames, reciting tales of gods and heroes, weaving memory into myth until the tribe itself feels woven into the fabric of eternity. Religion for the Celts was not housed in temples of stone, but alive in nature itself. They found the divine in rivers and groves, in oak trees that stretched skyward like pillars, and in springs whose waters shimmered with mystery. Sacred enclosures and open-air sanctuaries became their altars. Over all presided the Druids, figures robed in authority, keepers of law, lore, and ritual. They were judges, healers, and philosophers, their voices carrying the weight of both knowledge and fear. Though the Druids left no writing, their legacy is carved in the accounts of later Roman observers, who spoke of their power to bind tribes with words and to command sacrifice in shadowed groves. The Celts did not find an empty land. They stepped into a stage already marked by the ghosts of earlier ages, the long barrows, the silent circles of stone, the earthworks fading into grass. To them, these remnants were ancient beyond memory. Some they revered, others they repurposed, laying their own dead among the bones of forgotten ancestors. Stonehenge itself became legend once more, a silent witness to the arrival of iron and the new order it brought. Conflict was inevitable. Tribes contended with one another, their alliances shifting like the patterns of their art. Raids struck across valleys, cattle were stolen, fortresses besieged. Yet through strife, the Celts spread their culture across the island, stamping it with a shared style. Torques of twisted gold, chariots racing in battle, spiral motifs etched onto shields. Their language rooted itself deep, a tongue of poetry and cadence, some of which survives in modern Welsh and Gaelic. And with their arrival, Britain entered a new age. The Celts carried not just iron but identity. They were storytellers, warriors, and dreamers, their lives inseparable from ritual and imagination. Their presence gave the island a pulse that beat with fierce independence, a spirit that neither Rome nor Saxon conquest could entirely extinguish. Thus the mists of the early first millennium BCE part to reveal a land transformed. Hill forts on every ridge, smoke rising from roundhouses, chants rising from oak groves, and iron tools carving both soil and destiny. The Celts had arrived, and with them, the island's story quickened, fierce and unyielding, toward the next great turning of its fate. If their arrival reshaped the island with iron and myth, it was within their daily lives, woven through law, ritual, and artistry, that the true character of Celtic Britain came alive. Celtic society and culture. The Celts who settled Britain did not simply bring iron and fire, they brought a way of life that reached into every corner of existence. Their society was at once fierce and intricate, a weave of clans, laws, rituals, and artistry that gave shape to the raw energy of their age. To walk into a Celtic hill fort was to step into a living organism, every heartbeat synchronized to the rhythm of tribe and tradition. At the heart of this world stood the tribe, bound by kinship and loyalty to a chieftain. The chieftain's hall rose above the roundhouses, its posts carved and its fires burning longer, a beacon of authority and hospitality. Power was not absolute but performed, proven in feasts, secured in war, and sanctified in ritual. Warriors swore oaths to follow their lord into battle, their courage not only a matter of survival but of honor, for reputation was currency in the Celtic world. A man's name, sung by bards, could outlive his flesh, and so bravery became a form of immortality. Yet the tribe was more than warriors. Farmers tilled the soil with iron plows, coaxing barley and wheat from stubborn earth. Herds of cattle grazed on open pastures, their numbers a measure of wealth. Women played central roles in this economy, weaving cloth, tending fields, and in some accounts even leading in battle. The society was not rigid but fluid, shaped by necessity and the demands of kinship. Presiding above all was a class apart, the Druids. To the omniscient gaze, these figures loom as shadows in the oak groves, voices resonant with memory. They were philosophers and judges, priests and keepers of tradition. They memorized laws, genealogies, and myths, passing them orally from one generation to the next. In a world without writing, the Druids' voice was archive and scripture. They mediated disputes, declared taboos, and led rituals of sacrifice and renewal. To defy a Druid was to risk not only political punishment, but spiritual exile. Law and order flowed from this structure. Though tribes often clashed, they shared a sense of justice, rooted in restitution and honor. Compensation for injury or theft was measured in cattle, gold, or service, designed not to erase the wrong, but to restore balance. Reputation was everything. A dishonored family could find itself isolated, cut adrift from the web of alliances that ensured survival. Culture, meanwhile, shimmered with artistry. The Celts adorned themselves in bright garments dyed with natural colors, their cloaks fastened with brooches of bronze or gold. They wore torques, neck rings of twisted metal that gleamed in sunlight, signifying status and courage. Shields bore swirling patterns, spears were tipped with iron, and even everyday pottery carried designs of spirals and knots. Their art was less about symmetry than movement, as if every line sought to echo the eternal flow of rivers and stars. Music and poetry gave breath to this world. Bards strummed harps and sang of gods, heroes, and ancestors, their verses carrying the tribe's collective memory. A warrior's deeds were meaningless, if not immortalized in song. In firelit halls, voices rose in cadence, weaving the past into the present, reminding each listener that they were heirs of stories older than themselves. Religion infused every act. Sacred groves and springs were honored with offerings, swords bent and cast into rivers, jewelry lowered into bogs, food buried in pits. Such gifts were not discarded but consecrated, given to deities who dwelled in natural places. The Celts saw no division between earth and divine. The sacred pulsed in every tree, stone, and stream. This intimacy with the landscape gave their spirituality both immediacy and awe. And yet, beneath the rhythm of daily life, there was tension. Tribes vied for supremacy, alliances shifted, and rivalries erupted into raids. Hill forts, with their ramparts and gates, were symbols of pride but also scars of conflict. Power demanded spectacle, feasts heavy with mead, warriors boasting of conquests, druids intoning blessings. The society thrived on display, each act both survival and theater. To the modern eye, the Celtic world appears fierce and enigmatic, but to those who lived it, it was simply the order of things. Each sunrise reaffirmed bonds to tribe, to gods, to ancestors. Each season reminded them that life was fragile yet worth celebrating. Their society was not perfect, not peaceful, but alive with energy, iron sparking against stone, voices rising in chant, colors blazing in woven cloth and twisted gold. Thus the Celts turned Britain into more than a land of barrows and circles. They gave it a living culture, breathing law, art, and faith into its soil. Their world was a tapestry, threads of blood and beauty, ritual and rebellion, woven together into a pattern whose echoes still glimmer in the hills of Britain today. And if society gave them form, it was their rituals and beliefs that gave them soul, casting every act, from battle to harvest, into the realm of the sacred. Celtic beliefs and rituals. To understand the Celts is to step into a world where every hill sang with spirits and every river whispered with power. Their landscape was not mere backdrop, it was alive, inhabited by unseen forces, gods, and ancestors who demanded reverence. Where others might see a grove of oaks or the dark shimmer of a lake, the Celts saw gateways, portals between the mortal realm and the other world. Theirs was a faith without walls. Unlike the Romans, who would later raise marble temples, the Celts sought their gods beneath the open sky. Sacred groves became cathedrals of rustling leaves, rivers glimmered like silver altars, and stones rose as silent witnesses. Offerings were placed into these natural sanctuaries. Torques of gold, twisted until useless, swords deliberately bent and cast into rivers, cauldrons and vessels sunk into marshes. To discard such treasures was not loss but sacrifice, a gift given to powers greater than oneself. At the center of this spiritual world stood the Druids. Their role was more than priestly. They were intermediaries between tribe and cosmos, interpreters of omens, guardians of ritual. In the shadow of sacred oaks, they recited verses learned by heart, for writing was forbidden. Their knowledge was to live in memory, not parchment. They marked time with the cycles of the moon, calculated seasons, and declared festivals when the veil between worlds grew thin. When Druids spoke, warriors listened, chiefs obeyed, and communities submitted to the invisible order of gods. Festivals punctuated the Celtic year like thunderclaps in the sky. Samhain, the end of harvest and the onset of winter, was a night when the dead were believed to walk among the living. Fires blazed on hilltops, and sacrifices, animal, and perhaps sometimes human, were made to ensure protection through the dark months. Beltane, in spring, ignited new flames as cattle were driven between bonfires for purification and fertility. Each season bore its rites, binding human life to the eternal dance of sun and soil. Rituals carried an intensity that, to modern eyes, seems both awe-inspiring and grim. Roman observers, who often exaggerated their accounts, wrote of Druids leading human sacrifices, of victims bound within wicker frameworks and burned to appease the gods. Archaeology has not confirmed all these stories, but it has revealed burials suggesting violent death used in ceremonial context. Whether myth or fact, such images testify to a belief that blood and fire could renew the bond between mortal and divine. Beyond the rites of sacrifice, daily devotion was woven into life. A warrior might dedicate his spear to a river before battle, asking for victory. A farmer might bury grain in the earth as an offering for fertile harvest. Women tied votive objects to trees, letting wind and rain carry prayers skyward. The entire community lived in a rhythm where the sacred was never far, where each act had the weight of ritual, and each ritual had the immediacy of survival. The gods themselves were as varied as the land. Some ruled over war and sovereignty, others over rivers, forests, or fertility. Many were depicted with animal forms, the stag, the boar, the horse, creatures whose strength and mystery embodied divine presence. Unlike the monolithic faiths that would later dominate Europe, Celtic religion was fluid, local, alive with countless deities and spirits. It reflected a world where the sacred could never be contained, only encountered. To the omniscient eye, a Celtic ritual unfolds in vivid tableau. The night is cold, the moon high. In a clearing of oaks, torches flicker, shadows leaping across painted faces. A druid raises his staff, chanting words older than memory. Around him, warriors beat shields in rhythm. Women scatter grain, and children watch wide-eyed as fire roars into the sky. The air is thick with smoke and belief, with fear and hope entwined. In that moment, the tribe feels not small but immense, part of a cosmos that hears and answers. These rituals were not superstition, but survival. In a world of fragile harvests, sudden raids, and harsh winters, the Celts sought control through communion with the unseen. Their gods gave them courage, their sacrifices gave them confidence, and their festivals bound them together as one. Through ritual, the tribe became more than its individuals. It became eternal, carried forward by chants, fire, and faith. Thus the Celtic imagination filled Britain not only with iron and art, but with a spiritual landscape as potent as its physical one. They taught the island to see the sacred in every tree, every river, every stone. And though centuries would pass, though empires would invade and religions would shift, the echo of their rituals would never entirely fade. Even today, in the hills and groves of Britain, the air seems to remember. What began as sacrifice by fire and song became memory by stone and story, the enduring inheritance of the Celts within England's unfolding past, the legacy of the Celts in English history. When the Celts first laid claim to Britain's valleys and hills, they could not have known how long their spirit would endure. Empires would come, armies would march, kings would rise and fall, but the echo of the Celts lingered, woven into the soil, the language, and the imagination of the island itself. Their legacy was not merely what they built, but how they taught Britain to dream. Their imprint on the land was deep and visible. Hill forts crowned ridges from Dorset to Northumberland, silent reminders of an age when tribes defended their cattle and kin with iron and courage. Barrows and ritual sites carried the bones of their ancestors, still waiting beneath the turf. Roads traced through valleys once followed by Celtic chariots would later become Roman highways, and then medieval tracks, but their origins were tribal paths beaten out by countless feet. The Celts inscribed the island with patterns of settlement and movement that outlasted their tribes. More enduring still was their language. Though Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Norman French would one day reshape the tongue of England, Celtic speech survived in corners of the island, defiant and unyielding. Welsh, Cornish, Gaelic, these voices carry forward the cadence of the Iron Age. Even in English, faint shadows remain. River names like Thames, Avon, and Severn bear Celtic roots, their syllables flowing unchanged through millennia. Every time these names are spoken, the Celts speak again. Their myth and imagination proved even more resilient. The Celts lived by story, and their stories refused to die. Tales of warrior kings and enchanted isles, of gods walking as stags or horses, of druids commanding sky and storm, these myths would seep into later traditions. In the Age of Arthur, Celtic legend fused with medieval romance, creating the enduring cycle of Camelot, Merlin, and the quest for the Grail. Beneath the armor of knights and the ink of monks, the heart of these tales still pulsed with Celtic blood. The art of the Celts also left its mark. Their spirals, knots, and swirling motifs did not vanish with conquest. Instead, they re-emerged in illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, their lines as alive as rivers. The torques, brooches, and shields unearthed from Celtic graves revealed a craftsmanship that later ages admired and imitated. Even Christian monks in Ireland and Britain borrowed from Celtic design, wrapping their new faith in patterns as old as the Iron Age. Their sense of the sacred landscape endured as well. Long after their groves were cut down and their rituals suppressed, the idea that land itself was holy remained. Springs continued to be venerated, trees honored, stones revered. Many Christian shrines arose where Celtic worship had once been, as if the old gods had simply changed names. The Celts had taught the island to see nature as more than resource, to see it as revelation. Yet their legacy was not only in what they gave, but in how they resisted. When Rome came with legions, it was Celtic chariots and war cries that met them. When Saxons arrived centuries later, Celtic tribes clung to Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall, retreating but never vanishing. They became the stubborn heartbeat of the island, refusing assimilation, their culture a living reminder that no conquest is ever complete. To the omniscient eye, Britain in the centuries after the Celts looks like a palimpsest. Roman villas overlay Celtic farms. Saxon halls rise where Druids once walked. Norman castles tower over ancient forts. Yet beneath each layer, the Celtic presence lingers, like the faint original script beneath newer ink. It whispers in place names, in songs, in legends of Arthur and fairy realms, in the very sense that the land itself carries memory. The Celts were not the beginning of Britain, nor its end. But they were its first great storytellers, its first great smiths of iron and myth. Their society, though fractured and warlike, instilled in the island a love of tale and symbol, a respect for landscape, and a resilience that centuries of invasion could not erase. And so, though the Celts themselves would yield to Rome and later to Saxon tide, their legacy was not buried. It flowed forward, shaping the imagination of generations. In every spiral carved in stone, in every river whose name rolls from ancient tongues, in every myth of a hero returning from the other world, the Celts endure. They are the unseen ancestors of England's story, still standing, like the stones of Salisbury, timeless against the turning of the world. Yet even as their spirit lingered in stone and story, a storm was rising across the Channel, a storm that bore the eagle of Rome and the ambition of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar's first invasion of Britain, 55 to 54 BCE. By the 1st century before Christ, the Celtic tribes of Britain had forged a world of hill forts, sacred groves, and iron chariots. To them, the sea was both barrier and lifeline, carrying traders from Gaul with wine, glass, and luxury goods in exchange for tin, hides, and slaves. Yet across that same channel, a new power rose like a thunderhead: Rome. Rome had conquered Gaul, and at its helm stood Julius Caesar, general, statesman, and architect of ambition. In 55 BCE, as he gazed across the narrow waters of the English Channel, Caesar did not merely see an island. He saw a prize, mysterious, untamed, rumored to aid Gaulish rebels against Rome. Britain became, for him, not just geography, but opportunity, an invasion that would add luster to his name and remind Rome that no frontier was beyond his reach. The first attempt was a gamble. Caesar assembled a fleet of war galleys and transports, crowded with legionaries, horses, and supplies. The soldiers, hardened from battles in Gaul, now looked nervously at the unfamiliar sea. To them, Britain was a land of fog and legend, inhabited by painted warriors who drove chariots across the battlefield like living storms. The crossing was rough, the tides unpredictable. When the Roman fleet finally neared the white cliffs of Dover, they saw Britons massed above, shields flashing, chariots waiting. Caesar could not land there. Instead, he sailed northeast, searching for a beach flat enough to disembark. At last, he found one near modern-day Deal. The Britons pursued, riding their chariots into the shallows, hurling spears, their cries rising over the crash of waves. Roman soldiers, burdened with armor, leapt into the water, struggling through surf, while missiles rained around them. The scene was chaos. Shields lifted against arrows, standards plunging into the sea, horses screaming in panic. For a moment, Rome's iron discipline faltered. Then, amid the confusion, a Roman standard-bearer, name lost to history, leapt forward, brandishing the eagle of his legion. He shouted for his comrades to follow, wading ahead into the fray. Ashamed to let their standard fall, the legionaries surged behind him, their pila darting, their short swords flashing. Step by step, they carved a beachhead, forcing the Britons back. By sheer determination, Rome had set its foot upon the island, but the victory was shallow. The Romans could not push far inland. Their cavalry was delayed, storms battered their ships, and supplies ran thin. The Britons, though fractured into tribes, fought fiercely, using terrain to their advantage. After only a brief skirmish, Caesar withdrew, his army battered more by weather than by enemy blades. The first invasion was less conquest than reconnaissance, a message written in salt spray. Rome had come, and it would return. Return it did. In 54 BCE, Caesar launched a second, larger expedition. This time, with a greater fleet and stronger resolve, he advanced inland. The tribes, led by the chieftain Cassivellaunus, resisted with guerrilla tactics, burning crops, ambushing patrols, vanishing into forests. Roman discipline clashed with Celtic mobility. The chariots of Britain became symbols of resistance. Two-wheeled vehicles drawn by ponies, warriors hurling javelins, leaping down to fight on foot, then vaulting back to retreat. To the legions, it was a bewildering dance, part battle, part theater. Yet Roman persistence wore down the resistance. Cassivellaunus was forced to yield, offering hostages and tribute. Still, Caesar did not stay. With rebellion flaring in Gaul and winter approaching, he withdrew once more, leaving no garrison behind. Britain remained unconquered, but it was no longer unseen. The impact of Caesar's expeditions rippled far beyond their immediate results. For Rome, they were triumphs of propaganda. In his commentaries on the Gallic War, Caesar painted Britain as a mysterious frontier, its people brave yet destined to fall before Rome's destiny. Back in the city, crowds marveled at tales of painted warriors and stormy seas. Caesar's star rose higher, and with it the shadow of empire stretched toward the island. For the Britons, the invasions were both wound and warning. They had repelled the greatest power of their age, yet they had also glimpsed the might of Rome. They knew the eagle would return, and with it, legions trained to grind down resistance. The memory of those landings, of bronze-shod sandals splashing through surf, lingered in tribal lore like thunder beyond the hills. To the omniscient gaze, the moment was a foreshadowing. The clash on the Kentish shore was not yet conquest, but it was destiny in motion. The Celts still held their groves and forts, their chariots and chants, but the storm gathering from Rome would one day roll across the island in full force. The first invasion was only a prelude, a drumbeat announcing that Britain's age of isolation was ending. And so the curtain closes on Caesar's expeditions. 2 brief encounters, victories claimed but not secured, retreats disguised as triumphs. Yet in the long arc of history, they mattered profoundly, for they set Britain upon a path that would one day bind it to Rome, altering its culture, its faith, and its fate forever. Yet decades passed, and Rome's shadow lingered only on the horizon. The eagle had touched Britain's shores but not bound them. The tribes still sang beneath their groves, their chariots still thundered across the fields. A century might have dulled the memory of Caesar's brief landings, but in Rome the island remained unfinished business, a prize left half-claimed. And when an emperor seeking glory rose in the city of marble, the storm returned with greater force. Thus began the conquest of Claudius. The Claudian Conquest, 43 CE. Nearly a century after Caesar's fleeting visits, the island of Britain still stood free, its tribes divided yet unbowed. The chariots still thundered across open fields, druids still whispered beneath sacred groves, and the memory of Roman sails on the horizon lingered like a half-forgotten storm. But the storm was not gone. It was only gathering. By the reign of Emperor Claudius, Rome was ready to claim what Caesar had only touched. Claudius, mocked by his contemporaries as weak and hesitant, sought a conquest that would silence doubters and secure his legacy. Britannia, untamed and exotic, became his chosen stage. For the emperor, the invasion was not only strategy but theater, a triumph to be paraded through the streets of Rome with elephants and captives as proof that even a ridiculed ruler could extend the empire's borders. The task fell to General Aulus Plautius, who marshaled an army of 4 legions, nearly 40,000 soldiers, supported by auxiliaries from across the empire, archers from Syria, cavalry from Gaul, warriors hardened under the eagle's shadow. Together they boarded ships on the Gallic coast and crossed the Channel in the spring of 43 CE. The sea that had thwarted Caesar was calmer now, but the soldiers still remembered the tales of painted warriors and wild chariots waiting on British shores. The landing was contested, fierce, and chaotic. The Britons, led by tribal kings such as Togedubnus and Caratacus, hurled their warriors against the surf. Painted with woad, they charged with spears and chariots, their cries rising above the waves. The Romans answered with iron discipline. Shields interlocked, pila hurled in volleys, short swords stabbing through the melee. The clash on the beaches was brutal, a collision of order and frenzy, of empire and tribe. Step by step, the eagle advanced inland. The conquest was not swift. Britain's forests and marshes became obstacles, its tribes elusive enemies. Caratacus, son of the Catuvellauni, emerged as a leader of resistance, rallying warriors to strike in sudden ambushes, vanishing into wooded hills before the legions could crush them. For the Romans, the campaign was a grinding march through hostile terrain, every victory costly, every step contested. Yet Rome possessed patience as well as power. Engineers built roads and bridges, securing supply lines. Forts sprang up like seeds planted in conquered soil, each garrison a reminder that the empire had come to stay. The legions pressed onward, carving Britain into a new province. In this campaign came a moment of spectacle. After months of fighting, Claudius himself crossed the Channel to join the army. He brought with him not only reinforcements but also elephants, beasts unseen on British soil. When they marched beside the legions, trumpeting, towering above men and horses, they struck awe and terror into the tribes. The emperor entered Camulodunum, modern Colchester, stronghold of the Catuvellauni, and received the submission of kings. There, in a city soon to be remade as a Roman colony, Claudius accepted Britain's surrender and inscribed his name into its destiny. Rome celebrated the conquest as complete, though resistance burned on. Caratacus retreated into the Welsh mountains, leading guerrilla campaigns that harried the legions for years. The Druids, guardians of Celtic faith, became symbols of defiance, their groves turned into sanctuaries of rebellion. To the Britons, the fight was not over. It had only shifted into a war of attrition. But to Rome, the conquest was a triumph. Britannia became a province, its fertile lands feeding the empire, its mines yielding gold, silver, and tin. Camulodunum was declared a colonia. Veterans of the legions settled there, and temples rose to honor Roman gods, and Claudius himself. Roads spread like veins across the countryside, stitching Britain into the imperial body. The omniscient gaze sees the contrast. In one valley, a Roman villa with tiled roof and mosaic floors, wine flowing in glass cups. In another, a Celtic hill fort smoldering, its defenders scattered. Two worlds collided, but one pressed relentlessly forward. The empire of stone, law, and road was claiming the island of groves and chariots. Claudius returned to Rome in glory, hailed as conqueror. His triumphal parade displayed prisoners, treasures, and even a model of Britannia herself. For him, the conquest was not merely a victory of arms, but a transformation of image, from hesitant scholar to emperor of destiny. And for Britain, the conquest marked the turning of an age. The Druids still whispered, the chariots still rolled, the tribes still dreamed of freedom, but Rome had planted its standards in the soil. The eagle had crossed the sea and found new ground. The island's story would never again be one of isolation. It was now bound to the fate of an empire that spanned continents, and in that bond lay both transformation and tragedy. Thus the island passed beneath the eagle's wings. The clash of armies faded into the clang of hammers, the march of legions into the hum of daily life. What began in blood and fire now unfolded in stone and order, as Rome set about remaking Britain not only by conquest, but by culture. It was here, in markets and villas, on roads and in temples, that the true weight of empire would press upon the land. Life. Under Roman rule, when the eagle of Rome settled over Britain, the island entered a new chapter. What had once been a land of warring tribes and sacred groves became a province of empire, reshaped by stone, law, and the relentless discipline of legionaries. Though resistance flared in forests and mountains, in the lowlands the Roman way of life began to take root, altering the rhythm of daily existence. The transformation was first visible in the cities. Where once hill forts crowned the heights, now Roman towns rose in grids of streets, lined with forums, baths, and temples. At Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the first colonia, stone walls enclosed marketplaces where traders hawked wine, olive oil, and glass imported from across the sea. Soon Londinium, London, emerged as a bustling port, its wharves crowded with ships from Gaul and Spain. Verulamium, Eboracum, and other centers grew into hubs of commerce and administration. To a Celtic farmer arriving at market, the sight must have been staggering. Tiled roofs glinting in the sun, aqueducts carrying water, Latin voices echoing where once only tribal speech was heard. The roads were Rome's most enduring gift. Straight as a drawn sword, paved with stone, they cut across valleys and hills, binding the island together in ways unknown before. Soldiers could march with speed, traders could move goods, messages could flow with certainty. The very landscape was reshaped into a network of control. Even centuries later, when Roman power had faded, these roads would remain, arteries of stone enduring while empires crumbled. Daily life changed, too. Roman villas appeared in the countryside, mosaics gleaming in their floors, central heating warming their rooms. Elite Britons who allied with Rome adopted Roman dress, spoke Latin, and decorated their homes with statues of Roman gods. In towns, baths became social centers where merchants, soldiers, and even local chieftains gathered to cleanse, gossip, and plot. The smell of olive oil mixed with the smoke of Celtic hearths, the clang of iron with the rhetoric of Roman law. Religion also transformed. Temples rose to Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva, but Celtic gods were not erased. Instead, Rome absorbed them, pairing native deities with Roman counterparts. Sulis with Minerva, Nodens with Mars. At Bath, the hot springs revered by Celts became the site of a grand temple to Sulis Minerva, blending traditions in stone and steam. Over time, Christianity too found its way into the island, whispered first among merchants and soldiers before spreading quietly into towns and villages. Britain became a crossroads of faith, its sacred landscape layered with old and new. Yet beneath this Roman veneer, the Celtic world endured. In remote valleys and highlands, tribal customs continued, Druids still held sway, and resistance smoldered. Caradocus fought on in Wales, his guerrilla war echoing the island's refusal to fully yield. Even as Roman villas shone, the people beyond their walls still painted their faces and clung to their gods. Britain was conquered, but never wholly tamed. The army was ever present. Forts dotted the landscape, their walls bristling with watchtowers, their barracks filled with soldiers drawn from every corner of the empire. To a Briton in the north, a Roman patrol might appear as an exotic parade, men from Spain, Gaul, Thrace, or Syria marching together, their standards glittering, their orders barked in Latin. These legions were not only conquerors, they were colonizers, building roads, bridges, and walls that imposed Rome's will as much as they defended it. The omniscient eye can see the contrasts of this new age. In Londinium's forum, merchants haggle over amphorae of wine, their voices a chorus of Latin, Greek, and Celtic tongues. In the countryside, a Roman villa gleams with mosaic floors depicting dolphins and gods, while beyond its walls, Celtic farmers still guide wooden plows through muddy fields. At Bath, steam rises from sacred springs, half pagan, half Roman, as supplicants toss coins into the water seeking favor. Britain had become a land of dual identities, Roman on the surface, Celtic at its roots. But beneath the apparent peace, tension brewed. The weight of taxes, the arrogance of Roman officials, and the desecration of sacred sites festered in tribal hearts. Though roads carried Roman power far and wide, those same roads could carry rebellion. The conquest was never absolute. It was a negotiation, uneasy and fragile. For now, Rome stood triumphant, its eagle banners rippling in the wind above towns and temples. The island was tethered to the empire, reshaped by its laws and architecture. Its horizons extended to the Mediterranean world. Yet Britain was no passive prize. Its people, proud and fierce, waited for moments to defy. Soon, in the figure of a warrior queen named Boudica, the land would erupt in fire, and the veneer of Roman order would be tested in blood. Yet history teaches that beneath the calm veneer of empire, sparks always smolder. In Britain, those sparks waited for a hand fierce enough to fan them into flame. Soon, the anger of a humiliated people would find its voice in a queen, and the land itself would rise in fire. The Revolt of Boudica, 60 to 61 CE. For nearly 2 decades after Claudius's conquest, Rome tightened its grip on Britain. Roads bound the countryside, colonies rose from tribal strongholds, and governors extracted taxes with ruthless efficiency. Yet beneath the Roman veneer, anger festered. The tribes endured humiliation, their sacred groves desecrated, their chieftains reduced to vassals. It was only a matter of time before the land itself seemed to cry for rebellion. That cry came in the voice of a woman, Boudica, queen of the Iceni. The Iceni had been allies of Rome, allowed limited autonomy in exchange for loyalty. But when King Prasutagus died, leaving his wealth to both his daughters and the emperor, Rome's officials chose greed over treaty. They seized the kingdom, flogged Boudica publicly, and violated her daughters. It was an outrage too vast to ignore, an insult not only to a queen, but to a people's dignity. From that moment, Boudica's wrath became the spark of a storm. She was no ordinary leader. Tall, fierce, with hair described as flowing like fire, she embodied both maternal grief and warrior fury. Mounted on a chariot, her voice carried over the gathered tribes, Iceni, Trinovantes, and others long humiliated by Roman rule. They rallied to her call, not merely for revenge but for freedom, to cast the eagle back into the sea. Their first target was Camulodunum, Colchester, the Roman colony built over the sacred ground of the Trinovantes. To the Britons, it was a symbol of oppression, crowned with a temple to the deified Claudius, an insult carved in stone. Boudica's army descended like a flood. The Colonia, ill-defended, fell swiftly. The temple became a tomb, besieged for 2 days before it too was consumed by fire. Roman settlers and soldiers perished, their ashes mingling with the ruins of empire's pride. The rebellion surged onward. Londinium, still young but already the beating heart of Roman trade, was next. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, campaigning against Druids on the Isle of Mona, rushed back but arrived too late to defend the city. Recognizing its weakness, he abandoned Londinium, sacrificing it to save his army. Boudica's forces swept in, burning it to the ground. Flames rose so high they blackened the sky. Thousands of Romans and sympathizers were slain. From there, Verulamium, St. Albans, suffered the same fate. By some accounts, nearly 70,000 died in the rebellion's path. For a moment, it seemed Rome might lose Britain altogether. The empire that had subdued Gaul and Spain now teetered on the edge of defeat at the hands of tribes united under a queen's vengeance. The omniscient gaze sees the island aflame. Roads, once symbols of Roman order, now conduits of destruction. Towns turned to pyres, the eagle humbled before the fury of its subjects. But Rome had not yet fallen. Suetonius Paulinus, grim and disciplined, gathered what forces he could. He chose his ground carefully, an open plain with a forest at his back, forcing the Britons to charge headlong into the disciplined ranks of his legions. Boudicca's army, vast and fierce but undisciplined, arrived with wagons and families in tow, their numbers swelling with passion but weighed down by chaos. The battle was decisive. The Romans formed a wedge, Pila flying in deadly volleys before short swords cut into the mass. The Britons fought with courage, their chariots and cries filling the air, but they could not break the wall of shields. As the tide turned, their retreat was blocked by their own wagons. What had begun as triumph collapsed into slaughter. Tens of thousands fell. Rome's discipline crushed freedom's fury. Boudicca's fate is shrouded in legend. Some say she took poison rather than fall captive, others that illness claimed her after defeat. Whatever her end, her name survived as symbol. To Rome, she was a rebel queen subdued. To Britain, she was memory and myth, the woman who defied an empire. The revolt left scars on both sides. For Rome, it was a warning. Conquest in Britain would not come without blood. The governors that followed tempered force with caution, rebuilding cities and extending law, but always wary of the island's untamed spirit. For the tribes, it was proof of their strength, even in defeat. They had burned the empire's cities, shaken its pride, and carved their defiance into history. The omniscient voice sees the aftermath, Londinium smoldering, its streets littered with ruin, survivors rebuilding amidst ash, the eagle standard rising again, but forever shadowed by the memory of fire. Boudicca's revolt had not ended Roman rule, but it had revealed the island's soul, proud, unyielding, unwilling to bow quietly to empire. In the centuries to come, Britain would be more Romanized, its towns growing, its villas spreading, its people adopting Latin speech and Roman gods. But beneath the mosaics and marble, the memory of Boudicca endured. She became a legend whispered in hills and forests, a ghost of freedom haunting Rome's new province. And so, through fire and blood, Britain's story under Rome reached its first great climax. The clash between imperial order and native fury, embodied in a queen who dared to rise against the most powerful empire on earth. Yet even after the fires of Boudicca's rebellion had burned out, Rome discovered that Britain's defiance was not confined to a single queen or a single moment. Rebellion might be crushed, but resistance endured, waiting in the highlands, where new foes would rise to test the empire's resolve. Hadrian's Wall and the northern frontier. After the smoke of Boudicca's rebellion cleared, Rome held tighter to Britain than ever before. Cities were rebuilt, garrisons strengthened, and the imperial grip reached deeper into the countryside. Yet Rome soon discovered that conquest was never complete. Beyond the rolling hills of the south, in the wild highlands of the north, a new challenge rose. The unconquered tribes the Romans called the Picts. The Picts, fierce, elusive, and hardened by the rugged landscape, defied Rome's advance. They struck from forests and moors, melted into misty hills, and raided the farms and forts of the province. For decades, governors attempted to push deeper into Caledonia, the land that would one day be Scotland. Fortresses like Inch-Tooth Hill were razed, legions marched north, but each attempt proved costly. The land itself resisted conquest, its mountains and bogs swallowing armies as surely as its warriors fought them. When Hadrian became emperor in 117 CE, he inherited not only an empire stretched to its limits, but also the constant strain of holding Britain's northern edge. Unlike his predecessors, who dreamed of endless expansion, Hadrian was a realist. His vision was not to conquer everything, but to defend what Rome already possessed. And so, in 122 CE, he ordered one of the greatest feats of Roman engineering, a wall across the width of Britain from sea to sea. The project was monumental. Stone by stone, turf by turf, the wall grew, 73 miles long, slicing through hills and valleys. At some points it rose nearly 15 feet high, topped with battlements, shadowed by ditches and mounds. Forts were built at intervals, each garrisoned with soldiers drawn from every corner of the empire. Spaniards, Syrians, Batavians, all serving beneath the eagle. Mill castles and watchtowers studded the line, eyes fixed on the horizon of the untamed north. To those who lived under its shadow, Hadrian's Wall was more than defense. It was statement. To Rome, it declared the limits of empire. Here the world ended. Here civilization stood against chaos. To the tribes beyond, it was both barrier and provocation, a scar across their land, daring them to test its strength. Life along the wall was a mixture of military order and cultural exchange. Soldiers drilled and patrolled, but they also traded with local Britons, married into families, and raised children who blended Roman and Celtic worlds. Markets sprouted near forts, where wine and olive oil mingled with local grain and livestock. The frontier was not only a line of conflict, but also a zone of contact, where cultures met and reshaped one another. Yet the wall could never truly silence the north. The Picts continued their raids, slipping through forests and across moors, testing the defenses, reminding Rome that no barrier was absolute. Hadrian's Wall slowed them, contained them, but it did not erase them. In time, even more walls would be built farther north, Antonine's Wall, but each fell back in the face of relentless resistance. The omniscient gaze sees the wall at dusk, torches burning along ramparts, soldiers pacing in armor, the wind howling across the moors. Beyond the stones lies a world untamed, where painted warriors wait in silence, watching, planning. On one side, empire and order. On the other, freedom and defiance. Between them stretches the wall, both monument and metaphor. For centuries, Hadrian's Wall would stand as Rome's northern frontier, not just in Britain, but in the imagination of empire itself. It symbolized the line between what Rome could hold and what it could not. And when the empire finally weakened, when legions withdrew, the wall would remain, a crumbling relic of ambition and caution alike. Thus, Britain under Rome was never simply a story of conquest, but of boundaries, of how far civilization could reach, and where it chose to stop. Hadrian's Wall was the answer to that question, etched across the land in stone. Yet while Rome etched its frontier upon the earth in stone and mortar, another frontier, one of spirit rather than soil, was quietly beginning to take shape. It would not be marked by walls, but by faith, and its reach would one day far outlast the empire itself. The coming of Christianity. While Hadrian's Wall stood sentinel in the north, marking the edge of empire with stone and fire, another frontier was being crossed, not one of land, but of faith. Rome had brought its gods to Britain, Jupiter thundering in the sky, Mars presiding over soldiers, Minerva guarding wisdom. Temples rose in towns, altars smoked with offerings, and Celtic deities were folded into the Roman pantheon. Yet beneath the clamor of polytheism, a quieter voice was arriving, carried not by legions, but by whispers. It was the voice of a new faith, Christianity. The first seeds came with merchants, slaves, and soldiers. In Londinium's crowded markets, sailors from Gaul and Spain spoke of a crucified Savior, risen from death, offering salvation not to kings or priests alone, but to all who believed. In forts along Hadrian's Wall, soldiers of Eastern origin shared strange prayers, making the sign of the cross before battle. At first it was a rumor, a sect from Judea barely noticed amid the empire's bustle of cults and philosophies. But Christianity carried a fire that did not fade. By the 3rd century, small communities were gathering in Britain's towns, meeting in private houses, breaking bread, reciting prayers in Latin and Greek. Their numbers were few, yet their faith was fierce. For in a world of gods bound to tribe, city, or empire, the Christians preached a universal truth. One God above all, one hope beyond death. The Roman authorities, suspicious of this new loyalty, at times struck back with persecution. Christians were accused of rejecting the gods, of undermining imperial unity. Some were executed, others fled into obscurity. Yet persecution only sharpened the resolve of the faithful. The omniscient eye can see them. A handful of men and women gathering at night, torches dim, voices steady, as they recite creeds that would one day shape kingdoms. By the early 4th century, change was in the air. Across the empire, Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity after his victory at the Milvian Bridge, 312 CE. The persecution ceased, churches were built, and the once hunted sect became a faith of emperors. In Britain, Constantine's story had special resonance, for he had been proclaimed emperor in the city of Eboracum, York, in 306 CE. To the people of Britain, this tied their land to the destiny of the new Christian empire. Soon, Christian symbols appeared openly. Villas bore mosaic crosses, churches rose in cities, bishops took their place alongside governors. By 314 CE, records show British bishops attending the Council of Arles in Gaul, a sign that the island was no longer a distant outpost, but a participant in the great debates of the universal church. Still, the transition was gradual. Pagan temples remained, sacrifices continued, and many Britons clung to old gods even as new faith spread. The two worlds overlapped. A soldier might dedicate his sword to Mars, yet send his child to be baptized. A farmer might honor a spring with Celtic offerings while praying to Christ for a good harvest. Britain in the 4th century was a land in religious twilight, where the ancient and the new walked side by side. Yet the direction of history was clear. Christianity's appeal lay in its promise of equality and eternity, offering hope to slave and noble alike. It spread not by conquest of armies, but by conviction of hearts. And in time, as Rome itself turned Christian, so too did its distant province of Britain. The omniscient gaze looks upon a villa at dusk. In one chamber, a family gathers around a mosaic floor, lighting lamps before an image of Christ the Good Shepherd. Outside, in the fields, an old druid mutters prayers to forgotten gods. The two voices mingle in the evening air, marking the island's passage from one age of faith into another. Christianity had come to Britain, not with sudden revolution, but like dawn spreading across a dark horizon. And though Rome's power would one day withdraw, the faith it carried would remain, reshaping Britain's soul long after the legions marched away. Yet even as this new faith took root, the empire that had carried it to Britain was beginning to fracture. The dawn of Christianity rose just as the long twilight of Rome began. The crisis of the Roman Empire, 4th-5th centuries. The Roman eagle that once soared over Britain now began to falter. By the 4th century, the empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had been under Claudius or Hadrian. Instead, it groaned under the weight of its vastness, stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany, from the Euphrates to the Atlantic. The strength that had once united the known world was fracturing, and those fractures would one day pull Rome's legions from Britain forever. The crisis began at the heart of empire. Emperors rose and fell in dizzying succession, often murdered by their own soldiers or rivals. Civil wars drained resources as much as foreign enemies did. Taxes grew heavy, bureaucracy swelled, and the loyalty that once bound provinces to Rome grew thin. The empire was divided and redivided, east and west, brothers and rivals, each half suspicious of the other. While Constantinople in the east gleamed with new strength, the Western Empire staggered beneath its burdens. Beyond the frontiers, pressures mounted. The barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Saxons, pressed relentlessly against Rome's borders. They were not only raiders, but migrating peoples, driven by hunger, climate, and the fury of the Huns thundering westward. Along the Rhine and the Danube, Roman forts were besieged, cities plundered, provinces destabilized. The empire's defenses, once a shield of iron, now seemed porous. Britain, perched at the edge of this storm, felt the tremors acutely. The legions stationed on Hadrian's Wall and across the province were increasingly drawn away to defend the empire's core. Garrison towns lost their soldiers. Roads no longer carried endless columns of troops, but only the trickle of officials demanding taxes. Local communities, once secure under Rome's mailed fist, now faced threats alone. From the north came the Picts, pressing beyond the wall with sudden raids. From the west, Irish raiders crossed the sea, plundering settlements and carrying captives back to their shores. And from across the North Sea came the first stirrings of Saxon incursions, Germanic seafarers testing the coasts that would one day be theirs. Britain, once the proud jewel of conquest, was becoming a frontier too fragile to hold. The omniscient eye sees the contrast starkly. In Londinium, merchants still gather in forums, their stalls heavy with imported goods. But whispers run through the crowd. The legions are gone, the roads unsafe. Villas in the countryside glow with mosaics of Christian symbols, yet their owners listen at night for the sound of raiders in the dark. Along Hadrian's Wall, half-abandoned forts crumble, their gates open to the wind. Rome's order is fraying, thread by thread. And within, another transformation shook the empire. Faith. Christianity, once persecuted, was now dominant. Pagan temples fell silent, bishops rose in authority, and the empire's soul shifted from the old gods to the new. In Britain, churches spread, bishops attended councils, and crosses gleamed where once Jupiter and Mars had ruled. Yet this spiritual change could not disguise the material decay. Faith might comfort, but it could not summon legions to defend the coasts. By the late 4th century, the crisis reached crescendo. In 410 CE, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric, a shock that reverberated across the empire. If the Eternal City could fall, what hope had distant Britain? When the provinces called for aid, the Emperor Honorius sent back a grim reply. The cities must look to their own defense. The legions would not return. Thus, the fate of Britain shifted. No longer the guarded province of Rome, it was left to stand alone, its people caught between fading Roman order and the rising tide of new invaders. The eagle banners that once proclaimed empire now drooped in forgotten garrisons. Britain, abandoned, stood on the edge of a dark new age. The crisis of the empire was not only the decline of power, but the end of certainty. What had seemed eternal revealed itself as mortal. The provinces that had once looked to Rome as mother now faced the world as orphans. And in Britain, the silence of departing legions marked not peace, but the beginning of a storm. Thus, as Rome's shadow receded, Britain stood at a crossroads, no longer shielded by the empire's might, yet not yet master of its own fate. What followed was an age of struggle, when the Britons would learn what it meant to face the storm alone. The Britons struggled to defend themselves. When the last standards of Rome slipped from Britain's shores, the silence they left behind was deafening. For centuries, the legions had been the shield of the province, their discipline the heartbeat of order. Now, with their departure, the island stood exposed. The Britons, heirs to both Celtic tradition and Roman rule, were forced to face a question they had not asked for generations. Could they defend themselves without the empire? The answer was not simple. Romanization had given Britain cities, villas, baths, and mosaics, but it had also bred dependence. The legions had guarded the frontiers. Governors had managed justice. Imperial taxes had funded defense. When that machinery collapsed, townsfolk and farmers alike looked around in fear. The walls of Londinium still rose high, the roads still stretched across the land, but the soldiers who once patrolled them were gone. The threats soon arrived. From the north, the Picts surged beyond the crumbling line of Hadrian's Wall, their raids cutting deep into undefended territories. They struck settlements, plundered crops, and vanished back into forests and moors. From the west, Irish raiders crossed the sea, swift in their currachs, snatching cattle and captives, burning villages before retreating to their own shores. And from the east, Saxon longships began to nose along the coast, their crews testing Britain's weakness. The Britons resisted as best they could. Local warlords and former Roman officers rallied militias, calling men to arms from farms and villages. Old hill forts, abandoned for centuries, were refortified. Stone walls, once symbols of Rome, now became desperate bulwarks for isolated communities. The omniscient gaze sees families huddled inside makeshift palisades, watching smoke rise from raided farms, praying their turn would not come next. Yet unity proved elusive. Without Rome's central authority, Britain fractured into regional powers, each led by a chieftain or petty king. Some sought to preserve Roman ways, ruling from crumbling villas, issuing edicts in Latin. Others fell back on tribal traditions, drawing legitimacy from ancestry and the land. The dream of a unified defense dissolved into rivalry, each region guarding its own. Still, echoes of Rome lingered. The Britons sent pleas across the Channel, begging for imperial aid. The famous Rescript of Honorius in 410 CE carried the emperor's blunt reply. The cities must see to their own defense. Rome would not return. It was a moment of abandonment that cut to the core, a parent turning its back, leaving its child to face the storm alone. In this vacuum, legends began to grow. Chroniclers of later ages would speak of a war leader, perhaps remembered dimly as Arthur, who rose to rally the Britons against invaders. Whether myth or memory, the story reflects the desperate hope of a people longing for unity, for a hero to stand where empire had fallen. Meanwhile, the landscape bore the marks of crisis. Villas once adorned with mosaics fell into ruin, their roofs collapsing, their fields overrun. Towns shrank, their forums abandoned, trade dwindling as insecurity closed roads and ports. Christianity, once nurtured under Roman protection, now clung to survival in scattered communities, bishops shepherding their flocks with little aid from abroad. The Britain of the 5th century was not the vibrant province of Claudius or Hadrian, but a land slipping into isolation, forced to rediscover resilience. Yet even in struggle, the Britons endured. They fought, they rebuilt, they clung to their fields and their faith. Their story in this darkening age was not only one of loss, but of survival. The omniscient gaze sees a farmer standing guard at night with spear in hand, a village lighting fires on a hill to warn of raiders, a priest lifting prayers in a half-ruined church. Each act was defiance, a refusal to let the island's story end. The fall of Rome did not erase Britain. It transformed it. Cut adrift, the island learned once more to depend on itself. Out of fear and hardship, new leaders would rise, new cultures would take root. The struggle of the Britons in the 5th century was the crucible from which a new chapter would be forged, the dawn of kingdoms, and the age of Saxons yet to come. And yet, in the midst of this storm, the Britons clung not only to arms and faith, but to stories. Tales of leaders who rose against despair. Out of memory and longing, one name would echo above all. Arthur, the legend of King Arthur and the memory of resistance. When Rome's shadow vanished from Britain, the island trembled under the weight of chaos. Tribes fractured, raiders swarmed, and the old order decayed into dust. Yet out of that darkness arose a story, half memory, half dream, that would endure longer than any empire. It was the legend of a war leader, a defender of the Britons, remembered by later ages as King Arthur. History offers only fragments. Chroniclers centuries later wrote of a Dux Bellorum, a commander of battles, who rallied the scattered tribes against Saxon invaders. Names blur, dates shift, but the outline is clear. When hope was thin, a leader arose who gave it shape. Whether Arthur was one man, many men fused into myth, or only the invention of desperate memory, he became the symbol of resistance in a land abandoned by empire. The omniscient gaze imagines the scene. Britain, 5th century. Smoke curls from burnt villas, Saxon longships press against the eastern shores, and villages whisper of doom. Then, across the chaos, a chieftain rallies men beneath a common banner. Spears flash, shields rise, war horns call. In the clash of desperate skirmishes, the Britons, fractured and weary, feel the pulse of unity once more. Later sources speak of battles fought, of victories at places like Mount Badon, where Saxon advance was halted. For a generation, perhaps, the tide was stemmed. The Saxons did not sweep unchecked. The Britons held ground. Even if history cannot prove each detail, the memory of resistance mattered. It told the people they had not been conquered utterly, that courage and leadership could yet defy fate. Over time, memory transformed into legend. Monks of the Middle Ages, seeking to inspire their people, embroidered Arthur's figure with grandeur. He was no longer just a war leader, but a king, crowned in splendor, seated at a round table where knights swore oaths of honor. Merlin the wizard entered his tale, druids reimagined as prophets of destiny. Guinevere, Lancelot, and the Grail gave shape to ideals of love, loyalty, and quest. The myth outgrew the man, yet it preserved the essence. In Britain's darkest hour, a champion rose. To the Britons of the 5th century, Arthur was not yet romance, but memory, a story whispered at hearthfires, a reminder that they were not powerless. To later generations, he became something more, the embodiment of a nation's soul, a dream of unity that survived centuries of conquest. Even as Saxons, Normans, and kings reshaped the island, Arthur's name echoed in song and scripture, reminding each age that Britain once stood defiant. The legend of Arthur is less about fact than about need. In times of loss, people crave heroes to bind memory into meaning. Arthur fulfilled that role. He was proof that even in abandonment, even when Rome had left and the world seemed to collapse, the Britons could fight, endure, and believe in destiny. And so the omniscient voice looks upon Britain's twilight, crumbling villas, ruined walls, and frightened villages. Yet amidst despair, a story rises, bright as a torch in the night. Arthur lives, not in stone or chronicle, but in the imagination of a people refusing to let their spirit die. His legend is the bridge between history and hope, carrying Britain from the wreckage of empire toward the birth of new kingdoms. But legends alone could not halt the turning tide. Even as Arthur's memory lingered like a torch in the night, the winds from across the North Sea carried a new force, one not of fading empire, but of rising peoples. The Anglo-Saxon arrival. 5th to 6th centuries. The island, once guarded by Rome and haunted by legends of Arthur, soon felt the weight of a new tide. Across the misty North Sea, long ships cut through gray waters, their prows carved like beasts, their sails swollen with the wind. A new people came, the Anglo-Saxons, tribes from the Germanic coasts of what is now Denmark, northern Germany, and the Low Countries. They did not arrive as fleeting raiders alone, but as settlers, with families, herds, and hopes of new lands to claim. The story begins with desperation. The Britons, battered by Picts and Irish raiders, sought allies. Chronicles tell of native leaders who invited Saxon mercenaries to fight in their wars, offering land and gold in exchange for swords. At first, these warriors served as shields, but alliances soured. The Saxons looked upon Britain's fertile fields, its rivers, its abandoned villas, and saw not just spoils, but a homeland. What began as partnership became conquest. Villages burned as Saxon war bands pressed inland. The omniscient eye sees Briton farmers fleeing into hills and forests, clutching children and icons of faith, while Germanic chieftains raised timber halls on conquered soil. The clash was brutal, raids, reprisals, shifting frontiers. Yet alongside violence came permanence. Settlements sprouted in Kent, Sussex, and along the eastern coast. The Saxons plowed fields, raised cattle, and buried their dead beneath earthen mounds that still dot the English countryside. For the Britons, the loss was profound. Towns shrank or vanished. Roman mosaics cracked beneath weeds. Latin words faded as Germanic tongues took root. Christianity, once strong, retreated to the fringes, surviving in Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland, while the Saxons brought their gods of war, thunder, and fate. The old Roman Britain was dissolving, and in its place, something new was being born. This was no swift conquest, but a slow transformation, a tide that rose year by year until the eastern lands were Anglo-Saxon heartlands. Britain was no longer one province, but many peoples, many cultures, colliding and merging. Out of this crucible would emerge the patchwork kingdoms of early England. The eagle of Rome had fallen, Arthur's shadow was fading, and now the banners of the Saxons unfurled across the land. Britain stood at the dawn of a new age, an age that would shape the destiny of the island for centuries to come. And as the storm of conquest gave way to uneasy calm, the Saxons began not only to fight for Britain, but to root themselves within it. The tide of invasion slowly hardened into the shape of settlement, and from settlement into power. The settlement of the Saxons and the birth of kingdoms. The first Saxon landings had been violent and uncertain, but in time the chaos settled into permanence. What began as scattered encampments along the coast grew into villages, then into realms. The omniscient gaze sees timber halls rising from the earth, smoke curling from hearth fires, and furrows carved into fields once abandoned by Roman farmers. The Saxons were no longer visitors. They were becoming the new masters of the land. Each tribe, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, claimed its share. The Jutes took root in Kent, their settlements hugging the southern coastlines. The Saxons spread through Sussex, Essex, and Wessex, their names forever etched into the geography of England. The Angles pushed northward and inland, shaping the future Midlands and the kingdom of Northumbria. Piece by piece, a patchwork of territories formed, fragile yet determined, each ruled by a warlord or petty king whose hall stood at the heart of authority. These early kingdoms were not Roman cities of stone and law, but wooden strongholds, guarded by loyalty and blood. Warriors swore oaths to their lords, feasting in longhouses where mead flowed and songs of battle resounded. Power was personal, bound by kinship and reputation. Over time, these warlords styled themselves kings, and their lands, once mere settlements, hardened into the first outlines of England's kingdoms. Yet the transformation was not only political. The Saxons reshaped the land itself. Dense forests were cleared for farming. Rivers became arteries of trade. Burial mounds rose as markers of ancestral pride. Pagan temples stood where Roman shrines had crumbled, and the names of gods like Woden and Thunor echoed across the hills. The rhythms of life were tied to the seasons, the harvest, and the fortunes of war. For the Britons pushed westward into Wales and Cornwall, it was a bitter exile. They watched their ancestral heartlands taken, their language and faith driven to the margins. But even as they retreated, they carried their culture and memories, sowing seeds of defiance and legend that would endure for centuries. Thus, in the crucible of the 5th and 6th centuries, the Saxons planted the foundations of a new order. Fragmented, Warlike yet vital, their settlements gave birth to the early kingdoms: Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, Mercia, and Northumbria. From these would rise not only rivalry and bloodshed, but also the first glimmers of a nation. The eagle of Rome was long gone, and Arthur's torch flickered into myth. In its place, the banners of the Saxons waved defiantly over a New England, rough-hewn and uncertain, yet destined to carve its name into history. But no kingdom is born without blood. The Saxons, though they raised halls and plowed fields, had not inherited an empty land. Beneath their banners, conflict still smoldered, an unfinished struggle with the Britons who refused to yield. Conflict with the Britons and the struggle for land. The Saxons had settled, but settlement was never peaceful. For every timber hall raised, a farmstead plowed, or kingdom founded, there were Britons who looked upon their encroaching neighbors with bitterness. The island had become a battlefield, not of single war, but of countless small wars, raids, ambushes, clashes that bled across generations. The omniscient eye sees the borderlands ablaze, villages smoldering after sudden attacks, cattle driven off as spoils, and warriors clashing in muddy fields under gray skies. Briton war bands, led by chieftains clinging to fading authority, struck out to reclaim lost territory. Saxon feuds, levies of farmers and warriors bound to their lords, rose in defense, their shield walls bristling with iron. The struggle was fierce, and it shaped the very map of Britain. In the east and south, Saxon kingdoms expanded, their advance pushing the Britons steadily westward. Across the downs of Wessex and the valleys of Mercia, Germanic tongues took root where once Latin prayers had echoed. In Wales and Cornwall, the Britons held on, their hills and coasts becoming strongholds of resistance. Every mile of ground was contested, every river crossing a frontier of survival. Legends speak of great battles, of blood spilled at places like Mount Badon, where some say the Britons, led by a war leader remembered as Arthur, turned back the Saxon tide for a generation. Though the truth is shrouded, the essence remains. The conflict was not one-sided. At times, the Britons struck with desperate ferocity, and Saxon expansion slowed. At other times, Saxon numbers, discipline, and hunger for land overwhelmed them. The island's fate swayed like a pendulum between conqueror and native. Yet war was not only fought with blades, it was also a struggle of endurance. The Saxons, planting themselves deeper into the soil with each harvest, began to outlast their enemies. Their settlements became permanent, their children grew into warriors who knew no other homeland. The Britons, though valiant, were fractured, each kingdom defending its own, lacking the unity to drive the invaders out. In the shadow of conflict, a new identity was being forged. The Saxons no longer saw themselves merely as migrants or mercenaries. They were lords of their own kingdoms. The Britons, though diminished, nurtured the memory of Rome and the dream of a hero who would return. Both peoples clung fiercely to their claim of the land, and in that clash, the destiny of Britain was carved. By the close of the 6th century, the struggle had hardened into a new order. Saxon kingdoms stretched across the east and south, while Britain's strongholds remained in the west. The land was divided, its wounds deep, but from this crucible of war, a new chapter of history was dawning. The rise of Anglo-Saxon England, born in fire, blood, and the relentless struggle for survival. Yet even as the land bled from endless strife, life pressed forward. Beneath the din of battle, seeds were being sown, not only of conquest, but of change. From the ashes of war, a subtler story began to take root. The slow weaving of cultures into the fabric of a new society. The fusion of cultures and early Anglo-Saxon society. War scarred the island, yet beneath the clash of sword and shield, a quieter transformation was unfolding. As Saxon settlers took root and Britons retreated to their strongholds, borders hardened, but cultures also began to mingle. Out of violence emerged a new rhythm of life, one that laid the foundations of Anglo-Saxon England. The omniscient eye sweeps across the landscape, timber halls rising beside ancient Roman ruins, Saxon plows carving fields once marked by villas, and burial mounds dotting the countryside where Celtic shrines had stood. Despite conflict, exchange was inevitable. Briton craftsmen sold wares to Saxon markets. Saxon warriors adopted fragments of Roman fortresses for their strongholds, and language began to shift, Celtic words lingering amid the harsh syllables of Old English. Daily life was simple, yet resilient. Farmers toiled from dawn until dusk. Women spun cloth and brewed ale. Children learned to herd animals and tend the fields. Communities clustered around the Lord's Hall where decisions were made, feasts were held, and warriors pledged loyalty in return for protection and land. These were not grand cities, but intimate villages bound together by kinship and obligation. Religion, too, was a point of both division and blending. The Saxons brought with them gods of thunder, war, and fate: Woden, Thunor, Tiw. The Britons clung to Christianity, its churches flickering in the west. Though worlds apart, seeds of contact began to grow. Christian captives whispered prayers in Saxon halls, and stories of the new faith traveled along trade routes. A future convergence loomed, though for now the island remained divided between pagan ritual and Christian hope. In this crucible of survival, identity took shape. The Britons, though driven back, defined themselves by resilience, keeping alive their language and memory. The Saxons, though once outsiders, now called the land their own, forging bonds of soil and blood. Slowly, two worlds, once clashing, began to interlace in ways subtle but enduring. Thus, out of chaos, a new society rose, neither wholly Roman, nor wholly Celtic, nor purely Saxon, but something different. The first threads of what would one day be called England. Thus, as the fabric of daily life grew thicker with threads of both Saxon and Briton, the island itself was shifting. What had begun as survival and struggle was now crystallizing into something enduring, a land no longer defined by what it had lost, but by what it was becoming. The end and the opening of a new chapter. The island that had once been Rome's distant province now stood transformed. Stonehenge's silent sentinels still watched the horizon, relics of an age beyond memory, while Celtic legends lingered in the valleys of Wales and Cornwall. Yet it was the Saxons, farmers, warriors, kings, that now set the rhythm of Britain's heartbeat. The old world was not gone, but it had been reshaped, bent into a new order that neither Rome nor Arthur could have fully imagined. The omniscient gaze sweeps across this land. In the east, villages of timber and thatch hum with life. In the west, Britons chant prayers in small stone churches hidden in mountain glens. In the north, war bands sharpen their spears, watching the shifting frontiers. Each corner of the island tells a different story, yet all are bound by the same fate. An island remade through conquest, endurance, and adaptation. By the close of the 6th century, the chaos of collapse had settled into the framework of beginnings. The Anglo-Saxons, once outsiders, had rooted themselves so deeply into the soil that they could no longer be imagined apart from it. Their tongues became the language of daily life. Their gods looked down from sacred groves and hilltops. Their halls were the centers of law, loyalty, and power. Yet even as they raised their banners, a new tide approached. From Rome, not with legions, but with missionaries, came whispers of faith reborn. Augustine would soon land in Kent, carrying a cross instead of a sword, his mission sanctioned by Pope Gregory the Great. The Christianity that had retreated west with the Britons was about to surge eastward once more, meeting pagan Saxon traditions in a confrontation as profound as any battle. The story of Britain had reached a turning point. The age of memory, the Druids, the Celts, the shadow of Rome, was giving way to the age of chronicles, of kings whose names would echo in parchment and song. Kingdoms like Kent, Mercia, and Northumbria would rise, clash, and fall. Wars would rage, but so too would learning, law, and belief. The seed of a nation was being planted. The eye of history lingers on this moment, the silence after the storm, when one era dies and another stirs awake. The collapse of Roman Britain, the struggle with the Saxons, the retreat of the Britons, all of it was not an ending, but a passage. Out of ruin, something new was being forged, something fragile, yet enduring. The dawn of England had broken. It was still uncertain, still fractured, still drenched in blood and myth, but its shape was visible against the horizon. The stones of Stonehenge stood as guardians of forgotten pasts. The hills whispered the songs of Celtic bards, and the Saxons plowed the soil of a future yet unwritten. And so the curtain falls on one age only to rise on another. Britain was no longer Rome's province, nor Arthur's dream, nor simply the land of wandering tribes. It was becoming England, a name not yet spoken, but already written in the hearts of its people, and destined to echo through the centuries to come.